the pinnacle of the entertainment. Obviously, the character was incredibly entertaining, the $1 Million Man, but also you are, and I think this gets lost a little bit amongst us Marks. How you doing out there, Mark? It gets lost a little bit, the amazing technical wrestling you were capable of. You were a great technical wrestler. Do you think that today it's become too much entertainment and not enough sport?
I do.
Interesting.
I do. I mean, maybe I'm just old school, and I know that. I know there's a lot of things that change, and I know there's a lot of things that I haven't. I haven't been around the company for a while. That there are causes for change that I'm aware of. I'm certain of that. But even from fans that I talk to. Like the guys like Mike and I who wrestled in the 80s and the early 90s. I hear it all the time. You guys are the last great era of wrestling. And because it was still about the wrestling. It wasn't about, the blow up in the locker room or the story backstage or whatever. It wasn't all the talk. It wasn't the soap opera drama. It was the match. Ultimately, it was the match. I mean, our interviews back then, we didn't have 15 and 20-minute interviews. We had 3-minute, 4-minute interviews for the towns, and we might have 2 or 3 of those, but building up to it.
To be fair, though, you had better storylines back then. Every match had a really good storyline to it that got the fan involved, and obviously the match was the finisher, right?
Yeah.
I think that's what's missing right now. I mean, Mike, you've got children presently working in there right now, and I believe you worked as an agent. Are you still working as an agent for them?
No, I did it for almost 13 and a half years. I just finished up this year.
So how's your feelings with that, like the comparison?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed a lot, and it's hard to go on TV and tell a story wrestling if you have a 5-minute segment or a 6-minute segment and an entrance or 2 entrances. It's like a fast forward. Boom, 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 we're done. And I think time, because a lot of the talents there, I did a lot of live events, and they have 15 minutes or 18 minutes to tell like that. And I think they do so much better in that atmosphere because they're not under the gun, and they have to fit so much into TV because there are a lot of interviews and backstage and, vignette type situations. Then the matches aren't the concentration. More time should be given to that so you can tell a story wrestling in a match, and it doesn't have to be a 3-minute short story, I think.
So as an agent, when you would say that, what they just said, no, that's not the way it works.
It's not the way it works. You're basically told what they want, and you work with the talent, and then you work within your allotted time, because there's a lot of different aspects that go into the sponsorships. They have to do this, they got to have this, we have to advertise for our pay-per-views, blah, 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 whatever. And, some matches will have 2 or 3 segments, but there's going to be a bigger match, obviously. But to me, that's just hard to, unless you're doing a squash match, it's hard to have any kind of competitive match in a short period of time like that. And basically that's what we used to do years ago, was have a squash match. You were the guy, and I'm gonna get 98% of this match. You just hang on, kid. You know what I mean?
Right.
And that's how you got yourself over.
We say that all the time, though, but back in the day when we grew up on wrestling, right, like Morocco and Backlund would have an hour Broadway at the Garden, but, there was a lot of slowdowns, right, arm bars. Do you think today's audience just can't stand for that?
Well, yeah, because they're programmed from television not to see that. You know what I mean? Then it's boring to them.
Well, I say yes and no. I know that I know when I was working, again, for Bill Watts in Mid-South, he noticed that a lot of us were, he says, I'm seeing a lot of high spots. High spot, high spot, high spot. He said, so he took me and Terry Gordy, and he says, you guys are the main event all week. He said, I want you to go 55 minutes and then give them the finish. He says, number one, a lot of the what we call the smart marks are going to say, okay, they're going Broadway. And you're really going to screw them more or less when they go, oh, wow, they went that long. And yeah. So, but he said the idea is you can't have a 55-minute match and be bouncing around the ring all the time. You have got to settle down and tell a story. And that's what Bill was getting at. And so I agree with Mike. I said, but and it might be, and for the talent today, through no fault of their own, they haven't been exposed to what Mike and I were, 20, 30 years ago, in terms of the way they have been taught the business. We were taught the business doing it. We're in the ring with a polished professional who's leading us around by the nose, and he's got 15 or 20 minutes, for us to start to understand how this whole thing works.
And 15 or 20 years of experience.
Yeah, exactly. And so the young talent today, they don't have that. And, that's why it's kind of like when how long were you there, Mike? 13 years? Producing.
Yeah.
I left, and I've been doing my ministry, and I got a call from Arn, and this was back in 05 and 06, 05. Arn said, the company asked me to give you a call. They'd like you to come back to work. I started laughing. I said, do what? and he said, well, says like, being part of the creative team. And I actually had a conversation with Stephanie. I said, Stephanie, I'm not Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood's good on both sides of the camera. I said, my gift is you tell me what you want to happen, and I can go out there in the ring and I can make the story happen. That's my gift, But it was, and I did it for about a year and a half, and I just couldn't. And I don't know if it's I couldn't or I wouldn't, just because of the way I was taught and everything. For me to sit down with two wrestlers and map out an entire match just made no sense. I said, I can't do that. I can't do that because I never did it. In other words, the real art form of what we did was improv. It's like, oh yeah, I know the finish. I know exactly how it's going to end. That's a setup for the next show. And if I have a little history with you, in other words, if we'd already had a couple matches, we might go, okay, based on what the people saw last time, maybe we should start this way tonight. But all that stuff in the middle of the start and the finish was organic.
But how about with Randy at WrestleMania 4?
That's what I was going to ask.
Because Randy always was notorious for having a blueprint. Did he have a I got this great match here, right here, Ted.
Right.
That's the first time I ever did that, and I told Randy too, and it was funny because Elizabeth was sitting there. I said, Randy, I said, listen, I understand what you want to do, and I said, that's fine. I said, but give me this leeway as we're doing this. If something comes to me as we're on this track, let me call it, and we're going to come right back to this. Can you do that? He just kind of looked up at Elizabeth and said, Randy, you can do that. And he said, okay, brother, we can do it. And so we went out and tore the house down.
Wow. And you did.
But basically stuck to the game plan. But I just threw in a couple of things that weren't planned.
Nice.
So, Mike, you've just come off the working with them. Can you guys weigh in? Got a lot of pro wrestling experts out there that are always defending the wrestlers, saying, while we're on break, everybody, Farrah was talking to Ted about superstar Billy Graham, who seems to be still, we discussed last week, still angry over losing to Bob Backlund in 1978. I don't know why, but anyway. And a lot of these experts still talk about how unfairly wrestlers are being treated, that they're really not independent contractors. And then the most recent occurrence of the WWE saying, hey, look, you cannot use your name as to use third-party social media to generate revenue for yourself, your wrestling name or whatever contract you signed for. You guys want to weigh in on both those subjects?
Well, first of all, I don't know anything about what Billy Graham said and don't care. Secondly,
Fair enough.
you know, the wrestling business is what it is, and if you agree to get in it, there's going to be rules, whether I'm saying it's right or wrong. There's going to be rules for any company you work for. So unless things change, you have to deal with that, you know. And I know that some of these guys and girls are making a lot more money than I made in the wrestling business, so I wouldn't be too unhappy about it, you know. I would kind of work around it and deal with it, because like I said, I mean, go try to find another job somewhere. It's not that easy to make the kind of money you can make working for a WWE, you know. And unfortunately, is it perfect? Probably not, but you know, you're going to deal with that kind of thing in anything. There's going to be upsides and downsides, so I'm not going to jump on the mass wagon and try to bury it, you know. Especially I have two of my kids work there, you know, so
Sure.
and I'm glad that they're able to be there at this time. So
Well, and you know, it's kind of like they're not the only game in town anymore. There is some competition now, and I've always said competition is good for business. Competition ultimately is good for the talent because there is some, you know, competition is always good for anybody, because it's kind of like, you know, like when my kids were playing soccer. I knew some parents that wanted to put their kids on a team where their child could be the star. I wanted to put my kid on a team that was good, to where there was some people that were better than them out there, so that would make them better.
Make them better.
That was the whole thing. Competition's always good for business.
Right.
But still, the WWE is still the biggest game in town, and you know, whether you went to work for one company or another company, they are going to have their rules. And you know, it's kind of like the Million Dollar Man. The Million Dollar Man character is a property of the WWE. Now, I do have an agreement with them. You know, from years ago, you know, I asked for permission to use the character as it pertained to and in pursuit of my ministry. In other words, can I ask these churches to, you know, advertise me as the WWF Million Dollar Man? And so they wrote off on that. So anything, I mean, that's why.
So Vince didn't give you didn't give you an issue with that at all?
Not on that, no. And so that's why I can have a Million Dollar Man, you know, website, because I use that for wrestling, but I also use that to advertise where I'm going to be speaking and things like that. So, you know, it's not like you can't, you know, and again, I would rather be in a position where I'm working with the company as opposed to butting heads with them, because, you know, Mike and I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you right now if it hadn't been for Vince McMahon and what he did for the wrestling industry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know,
Bottom
we
line.
go head to head constantly with people who absolutely hate Vince McMahon. So I have to ask you guys while I have you here. And they hate Vince McMahon, a lot of them, because they feel that the old timers, quote unquote, the guys from the past, are not taken care of by Vince currently, that there should be pensions, there should be medical benefits, and all these other things that are obviously sensitive issues. Do you guys feel Vince owes the old timers a living?
well, in my opinion, that would be nice to have something like that.
Fair enough.
But in the real world, not everything is perfect, like I said, you
Absolutely.
know, and at some point you just got to move on and you know, and find happiness within yourself. I actually was out of the wrestling business for 3 years, and I ran a car lot for my father-in-law. My wife and him got in a fight, and then I was no longer at the car lot. You know, they got in an argument, which they regrouped later, but I called up John Laurinaitis and Jerry Briscoe, and I went back to work for Vince, you know, as a producer. and it worked out. I got a good run out of it, you know, a 13-year run. So I can't complain, and complaining does no good anyways, you know. And I just turned 63 years old. I could have worked a couple more years as a producer and retired at 65, but I made it this far and decided, you know, they let me go, and I said, there's not a problem with that. I've had enough.
Been a good run.
And, yeah, it's been a good run. And 23 more years on top of it, you know, wrestling over the years. So, you know, I can't complain.
We got about 15 minutes left. Fan out there, Nate, is asking, do you have any Rick Rude stories?
Rick Rude.
Not really.
Nothing?